Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. What do we mean when we talk about Black Americans? At one time, we thought we knew, but the steady immigration of Black people from Africa and the Caribbean over the past few decades has changed the ethnic composition of Blacks in the United States. What do native-born and foreign-born Blacks have in common? What attitudes, behaviors, and perceptions of the American dream separate them? How are they viewed by the population at large, and how do they view each other? And what political and social impact has the changing ethnicity of Blacks in this country had on Blacks themselves and on Americans as a whole? Christina Greer, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, addresses these issues in her new book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, recently published in paperback by the Oxford University Press. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
The germ of this book goes back to when you were a freshman at Tufts University back in the 90s, one of 60 Black students in a class of 1,200, and the largest group of Black students in an entering class that they had ever had. You write that at a special orientation weekend for the Black freshmen, you all were asked to raise your hands if your parents had warned you about getting wrapped up with the Black kids. And the only ones who didn't raise their hands, who hadn't been warned about getting wrapped up with the Black kids, were the 6 Black American students in the room. What did this tell you?
Well, for the first time in my life, I was actually in an academic institution with a relatively large number of African Americans. So I was excited, actually, to be with Blacks for the first time in an academic setting. I'd gone to relatively homogenous schools my entire life. So when I obviously opened up my eyes, because I thought it was a ridiculous question, and I realized there was clearly something going on that I was not aware of before I went to university. You know, I'd been going to Boston for many years. My sister was up the street at Harvard. So I was accustomed to, you know, an academic setting with high-achieving Blacks. But I had never disaggregated, you know, her best friends were Haitian and Nigerian, but I never really thought about it. I just thought she had really smart Black friends.
Well, one thing, you know, the overwhelming number of Blacks who had gotten into this very excellent school were not American Blacks. They were Caribbean or African. Does that suggest something about who's going to college and who's not, who are the good students and who's not?
Well, that's the narrative that we think we know. I mean, Lonnie Guinier has definitely done some work looking at sort of elite institutions that tend to, of the Black students, tend to have more Caribbeans and Africans. But as a whole, when you look at universities across the country, that's not necessarily the case.
Interesting. But it also said something about, you know, attitudes that Caribbean American parents, African American parents, I'm talking about Africa Americans, have towards Black students, towards American Blacks.
And I use the term Black American just to decrease confusion, but also in a historical sense, there are many Black Americans who don't necessarily feel beholden to the continent itself.
Right.
So just as a, you know, that helped me clarify certain things in the book. But I think a lot of parents, especially first-generation parents, who may not have had either interactions with Black Americans or first-generation parents who have had less than positive interactions with Black Americans due to neighborhood segregation or competition or perceived competition for jobs. They're definitely on the defensive when it comes to interactions with Black Americans, which, you know, the literature states trickles down to their children, and that creates this beginning of an attitude that can divide Black American and non-Black American.
What were the relations like between Black Americans, Caribbean Americans, and African Americans on campus?
Well, on campus, it was great in the sense that because we were such a small group, there was definitely a cohesive group, right? We were all, for the most part, almost all of us were members of the Pan-African Alliance, which on most university campuses is called the Black Student Association, but for various reasons it had gone through different name changes. But when I was there, certain students broke off and formed the African Student Association, and other students broke off and formed the Caribbean Students Association. But what I found fascinating is that they never gave up their membership with the Pan-African Alliance.
Interesting.
So we were always one large group of Blacks, but every now and again, certain ethnic priorities took precedence.
Right, right. Now, blacks in this country tend to be lumped all together, But because of immigration, African blacks and Caribbean blacks now comprise about 10% of all blacks in this country. How many blacks in this country altogether, do you know?
Around 36 million right now.
36 million, okay.
And that's, the census, as mandated by the Constitution, is, every 10 years we must take a census of the population. But we do know that marginalized communities, which tend to be communities of color, usually don't fill out the census at the same rates as other communities.
So they're probably more than...
They're probably more, especially when it comes to African populations.
Okay.
Because many Africans are coming, not in the traditional migratory patterns that we've seen in the past with Caribbeans. Some are coming as asylum seekers, some are coming as refugees, some are coming as doctors and lawyers, whatever it may be. But we have a feeling that we're actually underrepresenting the number of Africans that are actually
Now,
here.
I remember one time, so it's still about 12% black altogether?
Right, 12 to 13%.
Okay, okay. You write that a new type of caste system is threatening to evolve with the creation of elevated minorities.
Mm-hmm. So we've all heard the term model minority, which is often ascribed to Asian American populations, right? So of the immigrants, they are, oftentimes spoken about as the smart ones and sort of the ones who can come here and really make it. And so what I argue in the book is that historically we've had sort of whites and non-whites, right? Categories where whites were very protective of keeping as many people out of their protected white category. That goes for the Germans, the Irish, the Italians, Jewish people. And over time, they've loosened up the boundaries and become a little more porous, and they've allowed more people in for their own strategic and political gain. And so when I came up with this concept of elevated minority, is because even though it oftentimes seems as though whites just see blacks as this big mass, which sometimes that's the case, but every now and again, especially in educational sense and even occupationally, neighborhoods, there are whites and elites and people in power that actually do see a distinction. They may not necessarily understand the distinction, but they are seeing Caribbeans as immigrants who may necessarily work harder, or Africans as immigrants who have greater aspirations than this quote-unquote last place category of black Americans. And so essentially I argue it's no longer whites versus non-whites, but this category of blacks versus non-blacks.
Right.
And that immigrants are trying to stay out of the black category, and that goes for Caribbeans and Africans as well.
So if Caribbean Americans and African Americans are seen as the elevated minorities or model minorities, or more model minorities by whites, you also found that they're seen that way by Black Americans, right?
Right. So when I wanted to see how groups viewed themselves, I wanted to see how these three groups viewed one another, and the ultimate goal was not to say, okay, well, this group's smarter, and this group works harder, and this group has more promise, but to see where we agree and to see where we differ, and this is on policy positions, so that we could actually have substantive coalition building moving forward, right, as we become more diverse. But what was quite shocking is that Black Americans viewed themselves as sometimes hardworking, sometimes not, but they definitely viewed Afro-Caribbeans and Africans as very hardworking, as did Caribbeans and Africans. They viewed themselves as hardworking. And so if we say it's a scale of 1 to 7 roughly, and 7 being the hardest working, Africans were overwhelmingly seen as hardworking. Caribbeans were overwhelmingly seen as hardworking by all groups, but Black Americans were sort of in the middle,
right?
Roughly 4.5, not only by Africans and Afro-Caribbeans, but by blacks themselves, which lets us know there's something else going on with how Black Americans are viewing their prospects and also how they fit in America.
Right. Now, there are all these perceptions about which blacks have been more or less successful in achieving the American dream. Is there any data showing that there are different levels of success among these groups? For instance, in terms of school performance, level of education attained, income, home ownership, business ownership, participation in crime? Right,
and economists have proven that actually there's no model minority amongst blacks. So oftentimes the narrative is that Caribbeans are better off, more financially stable, have a higher education. And that's not necessarily the case. We also have to remember there's an immigrant selection when it comes to Caribbeans and even certain Africans, right? So if you are completely not motivated, not educated, not well connected, you actually aren't coming here, right? if you don't have the social networks, if you don't have the financial capacity, if you don't bother to fill out the forms to get the refugee status, you're not actually going to come here. So we know that with Black Americans, we're looking at sort of A through Z. But with Caribbeans and Africans, we actually have select members that are somewhat more ambitious from the beginning to actually come here.
Interesting, interesting. I mean, for instance, I would think that perhaps in terms of ownership, I know that's an area where Caribbeans are very, that maybe you would find a higher level of ownership among Caribbeans, but maybe not. Does the data not show that?
The economists are actually showing that, you know, when we look at the percentages, you know, obviously in New York it may appear a certain way, say Brooklyn versus Harlem, but when economists have looked across the country, that's not necessarily
the case. How about in terms of business ownership? You would think that entrepreneurship seems to be a thing that both Africans and Caribbeans are into more so than Black
immigrants
Americans
in general, right?
Yes,
yes. But, so this is the fascinating thing when you actually look at the numbers, right? The quantitative assessments of economists. They're actually saying, well, these are actually perceptions that we have.
And they're not necessarily
true. And they're not necessarily true. And so that actually was a motivating force behind the book to sort of start to peel back some of these layers, because we actually haven't disaggregated these populations in a way that I think we could or should. So there are many CUNY sociologists who have done a fantastic job, Kasnitz, Foner, Alba, to really, and Malenkov, to really think about Caribbeans and Black Americans. And so my question was, well, what if we add Africans into the mix? Will that sort of complicate some of your theories, or will they hold up as far as Black immigrants versus native-born Blacks? Or are they telling a very specific Caribbean Black American story? And we're leaving out, you know, relatively small in sort of global terms, but, or U.S., you know, census terms, but a growing population, right? So I'm very clear in the book to say, listen, this isn't the end of the conversation. Certain books are the end of the conversation, to sort of shut it down. I'm synthesizing all the information. I'm very clear. This book is actually just a beginning.
Yeah, I'd love to see those statistics and what they show. We have to take a short break. We're going to be back with more with Professor Christina Greer after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Christina M. Greer, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. She's the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. It's just been published by the Oxford University Press. You write that the different Black ethnic groups have different views about the attainability of the American dream. Basically, that if you work hard, you can go someplace. That African Blacks believe in it most strongly. Black Americans are somewhere in the middle. Caribbean Blacks have the weakest belief in the American dream. I found that really interesting.
And so I should, you know, just back up a little. So this is based on quantitative and qualitative data, right? So I did a survey of a union population in New York City, Local 371, social services employees, but then I also followed up with interviews to sort of help explain some of this.
Okay.
Because these findings are actually, that was against my hypothesis. So my hypothesis was Africans being sort of, as a group, the newest newcomers, Black newcomers. They would wholeheartedly believe in the American dream. Afro-Caribbeans is sort of the second, you know, the group in the middle. I thought that they would say, okay, well, you know, we're working on it and it's attainable. And then Black Americans, as descendants of U.S. slavery, as ninth generation, you know, Americans, would say, you know what, it's just not possible.
Would be the most pessimistic.
They would be by far the most pessimistic. And what I found was Black Americans, you know, Africans, everything held, but Black Americans were in the middle in the sense that, I titled the chapter, you win some, you lose some, right? So many African American or Black Americans said, well, you know, you could have a child who's an award-winning journalist or a professor, and you could also have a child that ends up in the prison industrial complex for a small bag of weed, right? This is just, those are the breaks. So based on class, based on geographic locale, sometimes you make it, and then sometimes it really does feel like the country is working against you on a host of levels. And then Afro-Caribbeans, through the qualitative interviews to try and chip at why is it that you all are the least invested in the American dream, they argued, well, if I came here at the same time as someone from Germany or someone from Japan, why is it that I have a mandatory black prefix on my American status? Why can't I just work hard and become an American like everyone else? It seems like all the other groups, Asian, Indian, European, whatever it may be, they get to just become American. But I have to become Black American. And so they're seeing the residential segregation. They're seeing the complications with employment and employers. They're seeing the difficulty to have equitable education for their children, right? So immigrants, people of color, people who are poor, whatever it may be, they all want the same things.
Right.
It's just who ends up getting them is the distinction.
I wonder if first generation Caribbean Americans are more optimistic about the American dream, and then as they stay here longer, they become less optimistic.
Right.
I don't know if you're...
And so the Afro-Caribbeans that I surveyed and interviewed were primarily second generation, right? So so we have a generation and an ethnic story going on. So this is why I'm most fascinated with African populations, right? Because primarily the vast majority of the people in the sample are relatively newcomers.
Right.
So over time, will they look more like Caribbeans, where they sort of, it sort of look like a pendulum, where it swings far, where they're extremely pessimistic, and will they essentially settle in the middle like Black Americans?
Is there a pan-ethnic identity that's shared by the three Black ethnic groups?
I think, I definitely think there is, right? Because there's so many things that happen in this city, but also in this country that
just because you're Black.
This Black prefix is real, right?
Right,
It's not a
right.
figment of our imaginations. And so I think, and I mentioned this in the book, with Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo and Rodney King, and there's so many people who have Black sons, and nowadays, unfortunately, with the violence we're seeing, Black daughters, right? They now know that if the police are going to stop someone, they're not asking, well, are you from, are you from
Caribbean or Africa,
right.
or you're from
Are you
Georgia?
from Kenya? Because if you're from
Right.
Kenya, I won't stop you,
Right.
right? And so they're seeing that they're being lumped in this larger Black category. And there's certain things that are happening that are the antithesis of American small d democratic principles.
But you did find that in some instances, the immigrant Blacks will do things to separate them, to distinguish themselves from Black Americans, like holding on to their ethnic identities.
Right. And this goes back to a lot of the literature that I've read from the CUNY sociologists, where they've said, immigrants will oftentimes, maintain an accent, right? Or make sure an employer knows that they're not Black American, that their mother is from Jamaica or wherever it may be. And we're seeing this with Africans as well. And so this is the first time that we're actually seeing an immigrant group want to remain relatively immigrant, right? We know that the past narrative for most immigrant groups across the country has been to assimilate and or acculturate as quickly as possible, right? So that may mean changing your last name, making sure you drop the accent, making sure you move to a particular neighborhood, just making sure you can become quote unquote American as quickly as possible.
What are the points of friction between the three Black ethnic groups?
And the crazy thing is I didn't find huge areas of dissension, but immigration is still a question, right? Obviously, people who have family members who are immigrants tend to support immigration and spending for immigration at greater levels
Than Black Americans.
Than Black Americans. Black Americans tend to support social welfare at greater rates because many people from the Caribbean and African countries aren't coming from places with social welfare states. So there is this ethos of working hard and not depending on the government. We know that there are many shared ideologies about how they feel as though they're treated by whites, how we should spend money on education and Social Security and sort of these big ticket items. And so it seems like the nuance and the devil is in the details, more on local politics issues that can be controlled by individuals in small level leadership positions.
So what's the significance of any of this? What difference does it make? Why should we care?
Right. Well, I mean, for me, as a beginning conversation, right, when we look at Brooklyn, for instance, where we now have neighborhoods that are a traditionally Black neighborhood, but they're also a traditionally Caribbean neighborhood as well. And so how will this affect how we choose leaders, right? How we choose elected officials. And we're starting to see some of this play out in Miami. We'll start to see it play out in different ways in Washington, D.C., which has a very large Ethiopian and Nigerian population. And so I want to also know well, how can the three groups actually come together and maximize their political power so that we don't end up as this splintered group that's running in three different directions and blacks end up with absolutely nothing.
Did you, and I don't know if this was even a question that came up, but do you think that there's a feeling that one of the reasons Barack Obama has been so successful, got himself elected president, because his father, the black half of him, is not Black American, but African?
Well, I mean, I mentioned this in the book just as a hypothetical. I mean, that narrative is very strong, right? We don't have a president who's a descendant of U.S. slavery. And so, I mean, this is, you know, I ask my students all the time, what if he said, you know, my mother's from Duluth and my father's from Detroit? Like, that actually means something to white Americans and black Americans across the country. If he said, my mother's from Nebraska and my father's from Nigeria, that actually means something for white Americans and black Americans across the country. So, I mean, I think the fascinating part
What does it mean?
Well, I mean, when I ask my students what they know about Africa, and they say nothing, but then I ask them about Nigeria and the Congo and Kenya, they've got very different things to say. So they actually have assumptions about these various countries, even if they've never been there. So this is a very interesting moment in time for the three groups to negotiate how they feel about being black and American in America in the 21st century.
Do you think there are lessons Black Americans, you know, given what the attitudes are of these Black ethnic groups towards each other, do you think there are lessons Black Americans could learn from the experience, the attitudes, the behavior of African and Caribbean immigrants? And are there lessons African and Caribbean Blacks could learn from the experience, attitudes, and behavior of Black Americans?
Well, I definitely think that's the case. And I think it's happening. I think these are conversations that black communities have been having amongst ourselves for quite some time. So the same way that, you know, students raise their hand because their parents have told them to be wary of black Americans, those same parents are often having conversations with their children about what it means to be black in America and build these bonds. I mean, the reason why those students were on the trip is because their parents actually instilled a certain level of blackness within them. A certain shared identity that does exist. And I think with neighborhood segregation and with the inequities that continue to exist in the United States, these conversations are now being had, not necessarily in a competitive fashion in the same way, but as a more productive way of trying to figure out what the next steps should be. Because without a larger group, nothing will actually move forward.
Well, just picking up on that, you said earlier that you are concerned about what are the possibilities for a political coalition of these three Black ethnic groups. And I guess, you know, and I've heard that over the years. Does it matter if these groups form a coalition with each other, or, you know, or if they form a coalition with other groups, for instance, with Puerto Ricans or whomever?
Right, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. And so I think my beginning conversation was just to say, well, if we are going to form substantive coalitions, right, not just descriptive coalitions, but substantive coalitions, maybe we should think about the policy positions that we actually share. So they're not these coalitions, these loosely based, sort of non-effective coalitions just based on blackness, but they're actually based on policy positions and ideas that are shared between the groups.
What were the discoveries in your research that surprised you most?
I think it's the American dream question. I honestly thought that as blacks, as the longest members of the American polity, they would be the least optimistic. And I was definitely shocked to sort of hear this attitude of, you win some, you lose some. Sometimes it shakes out beautifully and sometimes it doesn't. And so I'm really curious to see if these Afro-Caribbeans will sort of have this pendulum, which I think it may be, and essentially settle in the middle. And I'm fascinated to see where African groups really think about their placement with this lack of exit option, with this immigrant selection, where they'll end up in the next generation or two, as far as their attitudes toward the American dream and their ability to actually fully succeed.
I found your findings very interesting and some of them surprising. I must say your book is a product of your academic research, and it is an academic kind of book. It's not, you know, reading for the subway, but I found it very interesting.
Great.
And I think that a lot of our viewers would too. We're out of time. I want to thank Christina Greer for joining us today. Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream has just been published in paperback by the Oxford University Press. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.